The first time Frank Carson ever saw Ida Dalton, she was running barefoot across a field of buffalo grass with her skirts hiked to her knees, screaming her son's name into a canyon that did not answer back, and something in his chest cracked open that had been shut tight for 8 long years. It was the spring of 1878, and the herd he was driving north for the Lonesome Star Cattle Company had just come apart at the seams along the rim of the Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle, scattered by a hailstorm that had turned the sky the color of a bruise and sent 3,000 head of longhorn cattle running blind toward the canyon's edge. Frank had been trail boss for 6 years, ever since Colonel Whitfield had trusted him with his first herd after the accident that took Frank's younger brother, Daniel, and he had never lost a man or a full third of his horses in a single storm the way he had that afternoon. Lightning had spooked the remount string loose from its picket line, and half of Frank's spare mounts had bolted off into the breaks, leaving him with barely enough horses to keep the herd moving, let alone chase down every stray calf and confused steer that had wandered off toward the canyon rim. He was still counting his losses, standing in stirrups atop his one good horse, a rangy gray gelding named Ranger, when he heard the woman screaming. He turned in the saddle and saw her coming across the flat, her dark hair loose from its pins, her face white as bone, and behind her an old man on a mule who could not keep pace with her terror. Frank did not think. He put his heels to Ranger and rode toward her, because in 6 years of driving cattle across half of Texas, he had learned that a woman running like that toward a canyon was running from the worst kind of trouble a mother could know. "Ma'am," he said, pulling up hard enough that Ranger threw his head. "Ma'am, what's wrong?" She looked up at him with eyes the color of strong coffee, wide and wet, and for a moment she could not speak at all. Then the words tumbled out of her in a rush. "My boy, my Eli. He went after his dog this morning and he has not come back, and there is a storm coming, and he is only 8 years old and he does not know that canyon the way he thinks he does." "How long has he been gone?" "Since before noon." Her voice cracked on the last word. "It is nearly 4 now." Frank looked at the sky, at the black clouds piling up over the canyon like a herd of their own, and he felt the old cold fear settle into his stomach, the one that had lived there since the day Daniel died. He knew what a flash flood could do to a canyon full of narrow washes and dry creek beds that turned to raging brown water in minutes. He knew what dusk could do to a boy who was lost and frightened and alone among rock walls that looked the same in every direction. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Ida Dalton. My husband and I homesteaded the Rocking D just north of here before he passed." "Please, mister, I do not know your name and I do not care who you are, but if you have men and horses I am begging you to help me find my son." "Frank Carson," he said. "I am trail boss for the Lonesome Star herd yonder, and I have got 12 cowhands and whatever horses did not run off in that storm, and every one of them is yours until we find your boy." He turned Ranger and shouted down the flat toward his camp, where his men were still trying to bunch the scattered cattle. "Jim Sorrell, get the boys mounted, every horse we got left. We got a child lost in the canyon." Jim Sorrell, his second, a lean young cowhand of 22 with a face already weathered past his years, came riding hard, and behind him came the rest of the outfit, 8 men on 8 tired horses, because the storm had cost them 4 good mounts that afternoon and there was no help for it now. "Ma'am," Frank said, swinging down from Ranger, "you climb up on my horse. He is steadier than anything else we have got left, and you know that canyon better than any of us. You will guide, I will lead him." Ida did not argue. She let him boost her up into the saddle, her hands trembling on the pommel, and Frank took hold of the bridle and started walking Ranger toward the canyon rim at a pace just short of a run, the rest of his outfit fanning out on either side of them into the breaks. The old man on the mule, whom Frank would come to know as Pete Higgins, Ida's hired hand and closest thing to family since her husband died, rode up alongside them, breathing hard. "I told her not to run off like that," he said to Frank low, so Ida would not hear over the wind picking up, But you cannot tell a mother to walk slow when her boy is missing. No, Frank agreed. You cannot. They reached the canyon rim as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and Frank looked down into that great red wound in the earth, a mile wide in places and hundreds of feet deep, its walls striped orange and white and rust where 1,000,000 years of water had cut through rock, and he understood all at once why Ida Dalton had been screaming. A boy could wander 1,000 different directions down there and never find his way back out, and a wall of floodwater could come roaring down one of those side canyons faster than any horse could outrun it. Eli, Ida called down into the canyon, her voice breaking apart on the wind. Eli, answer me. Nothing answered but the growl of thunder rolling closer. Frank raised his hand and his men fell in around him, waiting on his word the way good cowhands did, trusting their trail boss even when the trail boss had no earthly idea what came next. We split up, Frank said. 2 men to a side canyon. Work your way down and holler his name every few steps. Anybody find sign of him, fire 1 shot and we will all come. Do not anybody go alone, not in this storm, and do not let your horses get caught in a wash if that rain starts falling in earnest. We clear. Clear, boss, Jim Sorrell said, and the others echoed him. Ida looked down at Frank from the saddle, rain starting to darken her hair, and there was something in her face that was not quite hope but was not despair either, something raw and desperate and grateful all at once. Thank you, she said. You did not have to stop for a stranger. Ma'am, Frank said, and his voice was rougher than he meant it to be. I had a brother once who I could not get to in time. I do not intend to let that happen to another soul if I can help it. He did not know why he told her that, a thing he had not spoken of to anyone in years, but the words came out of him standing at the edge of that canyon with the storm closing in, and Ida Dalton looked at him like she understood exactly what such a loss cost a man. There was no more time for talk. Frank led Ranger down the steepest, safest trail he could find into the canyon, and the search began in earnest. The rain came harder as the light began to fail, turning the canyon floor slick, and the air thick with the smell of wet creosote and dust. Frank kept Ida beside him, both of them calling Eli's name into every crevice and dry wash they passed, while somewhere off to the north and south his cowhands did the same, their voices growing fainter, and then louder as the wind shifted. Pete Higgins had gone ahead on his mule, moving with the surprising speed of a man who had ridden that canyon for 20 years and knew every game trail and rockslide in it. It was Pete who found the dog first, a shaggy brown mutt named Scout who came limping out of a side wash, one paw held up off the ground, whining and turning back the way he had come as if he wanted them to follow. That is Eli's dog, Ida said, and there was a terrible hope in her voice now. Scout would not leave him unless he had to. They followed the dog up the narrow side canyon as the storm broke overhead in earnest, thunder cracking so close that Ranger shied and nearly threw Ida from the saddle before Frank got a hand on the bridle and steadied him. The walls of the little canyon rose up close on either side of them, and Frank did not like the look of the sky above nor the sudden trickle of water beginning to run along the canyon floor beneath their boots. Eli, Ida screamed, and this time, faint and thin and half swallowed by the wind, a voice answered, Mama. Frank's heart nearly stopped in his chest with the relief of it. He looked up and saw, perhaps 40 feet above them on a narrow ledge of red sandstone, a small boy pressed flat against the rock wall, his face streaked with dirt and tears, one leg bent wrong beneath him. I am coming, baby, do not move. Ida called, already trying to scramble down from the saddle, but Frank caught her arm. Ma'am, wait. Let me see how we get to him first. That ledge is not an easy climb, and it is fixing to rain a lot harder before it lets up. He handed Ranger's reins to Pete and began to climb, finding what handholds he could in the wet rock, his boots slipping twice before he found purchase. It took him longer than he liked, the rain coming down harder now, turning the sandstone treacherous, but at last he reached the ledge and found Eli Dalton curled against the rock, shivering, his ankle swollen twice its size where he had fallen trying to climb down after Scout. "Hey there," Frank said gently, kneeling beside the boy. "You must be Eli. Are you going to take me home?" Eli asked, his voice small and frightened, his eyes huge in his dirty face. "That is exactly what I am going to do." "What is your name, son, full and proper?" "Eli Thomas Dalton." "Well, Eli Thomas Dalton, my name is Frank Carson, and I am going to need you to hold on to my neck real tight while I climb us both down off this rock, and I need you to be brave, because I know that ankle hurts something fierce." Eli nodded, blinking back tears, and wrapped his thin arms around Frank's neck as Frank got him settled against his chest and began the slow, careful climb back down the wet rock face. Every foothold felt like a gamble, every gust of wind like it might tear the boy from his arms. But Frank Carson had spent his whole adult life trusting his hands and his instincts on ground far more treacherous than this. And at last his boots touched the canyon floor and Ida Dalton was there, sobbing, pulling her son into her arms so hard that Eli yelped in protest even through his tears. "You are hurt," she said, running her hands over him, finding the swollen ankle. "Oh, my darling boy, you are hurt." "I fell trying to get Scout," Eli said. "I am sorry, Mama, I am so sorry." "Do not you ever scare me like that again," Ida said, half laughing and half weeping, pressing kisses into his filthy hair. But the storm was not finished with them yet. Even as Frank looked around, he heard it, a low roar building somewhere up canyon, a sound he had heard only twice before in his life and never wanted to hear again. Flash flood water, coming down the narrow wash behind them, gathering speed and fury with every foot it traveled. "We have to move now," Frank said, and there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. "That water is coming and this wash will not hold us." He looked at his horse. Ranger was tired, worn from the day's search and the climb and the weight he had already carried, but he was the only sound horse among them, Pete's mule being too small and too old to carry a grown woman and an injured child both at speed over broken ground. Frank made the decision the way he made every decision in his life, fast and sure and without looking back. "Ma'am, get up on Ranger. Take your boy in front of you and hold him tight." He lifted Eli up into Ida's waiting arms once she was mounted, ignoring the boy's cry of pain as his ankle jostled. "Pete, you get on ahead of them on your mule and find the fastest way up out of this wash. I will be right behind on foot." "Frank, that is your only horse," Pete said, understanding at once what Frank meant to do. "You will be left afoot in a flash flood." "Then I had best start walking fast," Frank said and slapped Ranger's flank. "Go, now, before that water reaches us." Ida looked back at him once, her face a mixture of gratitude and terror, and Frank saw in that single look something he would carry with him for the rest of his days, though he did not yet have a name for it. Then Ranger was moving, carrying mother and son up the rocky slope toward the canyon rim, Pete's mule scrambling ahead of them, and Frank Carson was alone on the canyon floor with a wall of brown water roaring toward him around the bend of the wash. He ran. He ran the way he had not run since he was a boy himself, scrambling up loose rock, grabbing at roots and outcrops, hearing the water grow louder behind him with every heartbeat, until his hands found a ledge of solid stone above the flood line, and he hauled himself up onto it just as the first surge of water came boiling past below, carrying branches and stones and the whole violent fury of the storm with it. He clung to that ledge, soaked and shaking and gasping for breath, and above him at the canyon rim he could just make out the shapes of Ida and Eli and Pete, waiting, watching, calling his name into the storm. "I am all right," he shouted up at them, though his voice was nearly lost in the roar of the water and the thunder. "I am all right. Go on and get that boy someplace dry. I will climb up when this water settles some." It took him the better part of an hour, working his way along ledges above the flood, before he found a game trail that let him climb the rest of the way to the rim, and when he finally stood on solid ground again, soaked to the bone, his hands scraped raw, Ida Dalton was there waiting for him, alone, Pete having already carried Eli on ahead to the wagon they had left at the canyon's edge. "You gave up your horse," she said, staring at him in the last gray light of the storm's passing. "You gave up your only horse to save my son, and you near got yourself killed doing it." "He is a good horse," Frank said, because he did not know what else to say, standing there dripping and exhausted with his heart still hammering from the climb. "He will carry your boy home just fine." "That is not what I meant, Mr. Carson." Ida stepped closer to him, and in the fading light he could see that she was crying again, though whether from fear or gratitude or something else entirely he could not tell. "You do not even know us. You had a whole herd of your own troubles today, cattle scattered, horses run off, and you stopped for a woman screaming in a field, and then you gave up the last thing you had to save my boy's life." "Ma'am," Frank said softly, "there was not a choice in it, not one I could have lived with anyway." She looked at him a long moment, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat, and something passed between them that neither of them would speak of that night, but that both of them would remember for a long time after. They walked back to the wagon together in the last of the storm light, and found Eli wrapped in a blanket, his ankle already swelling badly, Scout curled against his side, and Pete fussing over a small fire he had managed to coax to life beneath the shelter of the wagon bed. "That ankle needs a proper doctor's look," Frank said, kneeling to examine it. "I do not think it is broken, just a bad sprain. He will need to keep off it a good while." "There is no doctor nearer than Mobedi," Ida said, "and that is 2 days' ride." "Then we will splint it best we can and you will keep him still," Frank said. "I have set enough cracked bones and bad sprains on the trail to know how it is done if you will trust me to do it." Ida looked at him, at this stranger who had already given so much for her son, and nodded. "I trust you, Mr. Carson." He set the boy's ankle with strips of cloth and 2 flat sticks Pete cut from a scrub cedar, working with careful, practiced hands while Eli gritted his teeth and Ida held her son's shoulders steady. And when it was done, Frank sat back on his heels and looked up to find both of them watching him with something like wonder. "You are good with hurt things," Ida said. "I have had a lot of practice," Frank said, thinking of 8 years of trail drives, of broken bones and snake bites and men thrown from horses, and of one accident long ago that he had not been able to fix no matter how hard he tried. That night, Frank Carson slept afoot beneath the Dalton wagon with his men scattered around the camp, having recovered most of his scattered cattle and 2 of his lost horses before dark. And though he was bone-tired and his hands ached from the climb, he found himself thinking not of the herd he still had to drive 400 miles to Dodge City, nor of the horses he had lost, nor even of his brother Daniel, whose memory had haunted every canyon and river crossing he had faced for 8 long years. He found himself thinking of Ida Dalton's face in the storm light, and the way she had looked at him like he was something more than just a stranger who happened along at the right moment. Morning came clear and bright, the storm having scoured the sky clean, and Frank rode with his men to Ida Dalton's little homestead to see the boy settled properly, and what he found there told him more about the widow than any conversation could have. The Rocking D was a modest place, a 2-room cabin of hewn logs, a small barn, a corral holding a handful of horses and a milk cow, but everything about it spoke of hard work and careful pride, fences mended tight, a garden turned and planted despite the late frost risk, firewood stacked neat against the coming winter though it was only spring. It was the homestead of a woman who had built something with her own 2 hands and did not intend to let it slip away. "My husband Thomas and I filed this claim 4 years back," Ida told Frank as she made coffee over the cabin's small stove, Eli resting on a cot near the window with Scout curled at his feet. "We came out from Missouri, hoping to make something of our own. Thomas always said this canyon country would be worth something someday, once the railroad came through." "What happened to him, if you do not mind my asking?" Ida's hand stilled on the coffee pot for a moment before she answered. "Rattlesnake bite 14 months ago while he was mending fence out past the north pasture. I found him too late. There was nothing to be done." "I am sorry," Frank said, and meant it. "We have 5 years to prove up this claim under the Homestead Act," Ida went on, pouring the coffee with hands that had gone steady again. "I am halfway through it now. I do not intend to lose this land, Mr. Carson, not to grief and not to anything else, though there are those who would be glad to see me fail. Who would want to see a widow and her boy fail at anything." Ida's mouth tightened. "Sela's web. He owns the Circle W, the big spread just east of here, and he has wanted this creek water for his cattle since before Thomas ever filed the claim. He has offered to buy me out twice now, for less than the land is worth, and when I refused him, he asked me to marry him instead, which I also refused. He has not taken either refusal well." Frank felt something hard settle in his chest at the name, though he could not have said why a stranger's troubles should matter so much to him after only a day's acquaintance. "Has he threatened you?" "Not outright. But his cattle have a way of finding their way onto my grass, and my fence has a way of turning up cut, and there are men who work for him who look at me and my boy like they are just waiting for us to give up and go." She shook her head as if shaking off the weight of it. "But that is not your trouble, Mr. Carson. You have a herd to drive and a contract to keep, I am sure." "I do," Frank admitted. "Colonel Whitfield is expecting 3,000 head in Dodge City by the end of June, and half my remount string ran off in that storm yesterday. I ought to be moving on within the day." Something flickered across Ida's face, disappointment perhaps, or simply the resignation of a woman used to people passing through her life and leaving it emptier than they found it. "Of course, I understand." But Frank found, standing in that small cabin with the morning light slanting through the window, and Eli watching him with the open admiration of a boy who had decided he had found himself a hero, that he did not want to move on, not yet, not without knowing more about this woman and her fierce, careful pride, and the way she had run barefoot across a field screaming her son's name into a canyon. "I expect," he said slowly, "that a herd this size, having been scattered by storm, will need a day or two to settle and be properly counted before we push on. It would not do to drive tired, uncounted cattle into rough country. I believe we will hold here another 2 days, maybe 3. Ida looked at him, and something in her eyes told him she understood exactly what he was doing and was not entirely displeased by it. "Is that so, Mr. Carson?" "It is," he said. "And in the meantime, my outfit has a fine cook, and more beef on the hoof than we know what to do with, and it seems only right that we should share it with the family that near lost everything trying to help us find our own way through that storm." It was a small lie, dressed up as courtesy, and they both knew it, but Ida Dalton smiled for the first time since Frank had met her, a real smile that reached all the way to her tired brown eyes, and said, "I believe Eli would like that very much, Mr. Carson. So would I." Over the following 2 days, while his outfit gathered and counted the scattered herd and rested the horses that remained, Frank Carson found more reasons than he could rightly explain to ride over to the rocking D. He mended a section of fence that Ida had not gotten to yet, whittled Eli a small wooden horse to pass the time while the boy's ankle healed, and sat on the porch step in the cool evenings talking with Ida about nothing much at all: the weather, the price of cattle, the way the canyon looked at sunset when the light turned the rock walls the color of a blacksmith's fire. It was on the second evening that Ida finally asked him the question he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "You said you had a brother back on the canyon rim that you could not get to in time. What happened to him, Mr. Carson?" Frank was quiet a long moment, watching the last light fade over the canyon before he answered. "Daniel was younger than me by 6 years. Our folks died of fever when he was just a boy, and I raised him best I could, working other men's cattle until I had enough put by to hire on as a hand myself, and I brought him along when I could. 8 years back, we were driving a herd up from South Texas, my first year as a full-trail boss, and we hit a storm not too different from the one that scattered my herd yesterday. Daniel's horse went down in a wash not unlike the one your Eli got stuck in, and I was too far ahead with the point cattle to reach him before the water did." He stopped, his jaw tight. I have spent 8 years trying to make sure I was never too far from anybody who needed me again." Ida reached over without a word and laid her hand on his, and Frank let her, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight since he was 26 years old and had to write a letter to nobody at all, because there had been nobody left to write to, telling them that his brother was dead and it was his fault. "You could not have known," Ida said softly. "I know that in my head," Frank said. "It has taken longer to know it any place else. You saved my son yesterday. You gave up your own horse and nearly drowned doing it. I think, Mr. Carson, that whatever guilt you have carried these 8 years, you have more than paid it back." Frank looked at her then, really looked at her, at the strength in her face and the softness underneath it, and he understood that he was in danger of falling in love with a woman he had known only 2 days, a woman with a homestead to protect, and a son to raise, and a powerful neighbor determined to see her fail. And he understood, too, that he did not much care about the danger of it. "Ida," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I do not rightly know how to say what I am feeling, seeing as I have known you all of 2 days, and I have a herd 400 miles from where it needs to be. But I do not think I have felt anything like this since before my brother died, and I would be a fool not to tell you so." Ida's breath caught, and in the last light of evening Frank could see the color rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Carson, Frank, I am a widow with a young son and a homestead I am fighting to keep, and I do not have room in my life for a man who will be gone in a week's time chasing cattle to Kansas." "I know it," Frank said. "I am not asking you for anything, not yet. I am only telling you the truth of it, because I think you deserve the truth from somebody, seeing as you have had precious little of it from that man Webb." Ida laughed then, a small surprised sound, and shook her head. "You are a strange man, Frank Carson." "I have been called worse," Frank said, and for the first time in 8 years he laughed too, easy and unburdened, sitting on a widow's porch step with the canyon going purple in the twilight, and her son's wooden horse warm in his pocket where he had been meaning to give it to the boy all evening and kept forgetting, because he could not look away from Ida Dalton's face. But the peace of those 2 days could not last forever, not with a herd of 3,000 cattle waiting to be driven north, and a rancher named Silas Webb watching the rocking D, with the patience of a man who had learned that some kinds of trouble were best delivered slow. It came on the 3rd morning, just as Frank's outfit was preparing to move the herd on, when a rider came up the trail from the Circle W direction at a hard trot, and Frank recognized Silas Webb himself before the man had even reined in, a heavy-set figure in an expensive black coat that looked out of place on a working cattleman, his face florid with the kind of anger that had been building for a long while. "Mrs. Dalton," Webb said, not bothering to dismount, looking down at Ida where she stood in her dooryard with Eli beside her, still favoring his bad ankle. "I hear you have been entertaining trail hands out here while your boy nearly drowned in the canyon. Folks in town are talking." "Folks in town can talk all they like, Mr. Webb," Ida said, her chin lifting in a way that Frank had already come to admire fiercely. "Mr. Carson and his men saved my son's life. I will entertain whoever I please on my own land." "Your land," Webb said, and there was something ugly in the way he said it. "You mean the land you are still trying to prove up, with your husband gone and no man to work it proper. The land office looks kindly on a widow keeping company with drifting cowhands, does it? I would think twice about that, if I were you, unless you want your claim challenged when the time comes to file final papers." Frank stepped forward before he could stop himself, putting himself between Webb's horse and Ida. "Mister, I do not know you, but I know a threat when I hear one, and that sounded a good deal like a threat to a woman on her own property." Webb's eyes flicked to Frank, taking in his trail-worn clothes, the Lonesome Star brand on the horse he had recovered, and something calculating moved behind his gaze. "And who might you be?" "Frank Carson. Trail boss for the Lonesome Star herd you likely saw scattered across half this county 3 days back. And I would remind you, mister, that Mrs. Dalton's claim is her own business, filed proper under the law, and no amount of talk in town is going to change what the land office has on record. Is that so? Webb's smile was thin and unpleasant. Well, Mr. Carson, I would remind you that you have got a herd of cattle to move north, and cattle do not tend to stay put while their trail boss dallies with a widow woman he met 3 days ago. Seems to me a man in your position ought to mind his own contract and let local matters stay local. Seems to me, Frank said evenly, a man in your position ought to mind his own fence line and stop cutting other folks' wire, if the talk I have heard is true. Webb's face went dark red, and for a moment Frank thought the man might swing down off his horse and settle things the old way, but instead Webb simply gathered his reins and looked once more at Ida, his expression cooling into something colder and more patient than his earlier anger. You think about what I said, Mrs. Dalton. Come the fall, when it is time to file your final proof, you are going to need witnesses who can speak to your continuous residence and good character. I would not count on a passing trail boss to be one of them, and I would not count on the land office looking past whatever rumors have taken root by then either. He turned his horse and rode off without another word, leaving a silence behind him that felt heavier than the storm had been. Ida let out a long breath once he was gone, and Frank saw that her hands were shaking. He has been like that since Thomas died, circling, always circling, waiting for me to give up. He will not get the chance, Frank said, though even as he said it he felt the weight of his own contract pressing down on him, the herd waiting, the deadline in Dodge City, the fact that within days he would have to ride north and leave Ida Dalton to face Silas Webb in the land office alone. You have to go, Ida said, reading his thoughts plain on his face. You have a job, Frank, a responsibility to Colonel Whitfield and his herd. I will not have you jeopardizing that for my sake. I do not like leaving you to face that man alone. I have faced him alone for 14 months, Ida said. I will manage a while longer. But that night, lying awake beneath the wagon with the stars wheeling overhead and the herd lowing softly in the distance, Frank Carson made a decision that would change the shape of the rest of his life, though he did not yet know how he would carry it out. The next morning, before his outfit moved out, Frank sought out Pete Higgins alone, finding the old man mending a bridle by the corral. Pete, Frank said, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me straight. I generally do, Pete said. Is Silas Webb dangerous? Not just a nuisance, but dangerous, the kind of man who might do more than talk. Pete considered this seriously before answering. He has not laid a hand on Ida, not yet, and I do not think he would risk it outright, not with the law being what it is even out here. But he has money and he has patience, and men like that do not need to raise a fist when they can starve a body out slow instead. Cut fences, poisoned water, false witness at the land office when the time comes. He could ruin her without ever breaking a law that would stick. Frank nodded slowly, turning something over in his mind. Pete, I am going to have to drive this herd on to Dodge City. I gave the colonel my word, and I have 12 men and 3,000 head depending on me to see this through, and there is no way around that. I did not figure there was. But I am going to come back. Once this herd is delivered and I am paid off, I am coming back here, and I am going to see about making things right if Ida will have me. In the meantime, I want you to watch out for her and the boy as best you can, and if Webb tries anything more than talk, I want you to get word to the sheriff in Mobity. And if that does not answer, I have got friends scattered along this trail who owe me favors, cattlemen and lawmen both. You send word to the Lonesome Star office in Fort Worth if things get bad enough, and they will know how to reach me or send help faster than that. You are serious about this, Pete said, studying him. I have not been this serious about anything since I do not know when, Frank admitted. That afternoon, as the outfit made ready to move the herd north at last, Frank went to say his goodbyes at the rocking D, and found the parting harder than he had expected any parting to be after only 5 days' acquaintance. Eli, his ankle healing well under Ida's careful nursing, presented Frank with a drawing he had made of Ranger, all wobbly lines and too many legs, and Frank folded it carefully and tucked it inside his vest pocket like it was the deed to a gold mine. You will come back?" Eli asked, looking up at him with the same open trust he had shown from the moment Frank carried him down off that ledge. "I gave my word to your mama that I would," Frank said, "and I do not go back on my word, not ever." Ida walked with him to where Ranger stood saddled and waiting, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the whole weight of the last 5 days sitting heavy and unspoken between them. "I do not know how long it will be," Frank said finally. "Dodge City and back is the better part of 2 months, maybe more if the weather turns bad or the colonel has other work for me, once the herd is sold." "I know how cattle drives work, Frank," Ida said, and there was a gentle teasing in her voice even through the sadness. "I married a man who drove cattle himself once before we settled here. I will write when I can. There is not always a way to send letters from the trail, but I will find a way when there is." "I will be here," Ida said. "This is my home, Frank Carson. I'm not going anywhere, whatever Silas Webb thinks he can do about it." Frank reached into his pocket then and drew out something small, wrapped in a bit of cloth. "I want you to have this," he said, and unwrapped a silver dollar, worn smooth with handling, with a small hole drilled through it. "It was my brother Daniel's. He wore it on a string around his neck, said it was good luck, though I suppose it did not do him much good in the end. I have carried it every day since he died, and I never gave it to another living soul. I want you to have it now, so that some part of me stays here with you and Eli while I am gone." Ida took it with hands that trembled, closing her fingers around the coin as if it were the most precious thing anyone had ever given her. "Frank, I cannot take this. It is all you have left of him." "That is exactly why I want you to have it," Frank said, "because I trust you to keep it safe, same as I trust you to be here when I come back." Ida looked up at him, tears standing bright in her eyes, and before either of them quite knew what was happening, Frank leaned down and kissed her, soft and searching, there in the yard of the rocking D with the canyon glowing red in the morning light and Eli watching from the porch with wide, delighted eyes. "Come back to me, Frank Carson," Ida whispered when the kiss ended. "I intend to," Frank said, "if I have to walk every mile of it myself." He rode north that morning with his herd and his outfit, and though the trail ahead was 400 miles of dust and river crossings, and the ever-present danger of storm and stampede, Frank Carson found himself humming an old trail song under his breath for the first time in longer than he could remember. And Jim Sorrell, riding drag beside him, remarked that their trail boss had gone soft in the head over a widow woman, and Frank did not even bother to argue the point, because it was entirely true. The drive north to Dodge City took 7 weeks, through the worst of the summer heat and 2 more storms that tested every ounce of Frank's skill as a trail boss. And though he thought of Ida Dalton every single day, sometimes with a longing so sharp it near took his breath away, he managed to send only 2 letters in all that time, from towns along the trail where the mail could reach south toward the Panhandle. He wrote of the trail, of the cattle, of small moments that made him think of her and Eli, careful never to say too much of his feelings on paper for fear the letters might be read by strangers before ever reaching her hands, but signing each one with words that left no doubt of his heart. "Yours always, Frank." Ida, for her part, faced a summer of her own trials back at the Rocking D. Silas Webb did not relent in his campaign, and twice more her fence line turned up cut, cattle from the Circle W grazing where they had no business, and once a note left tacked to her barn door suggesting, in language just short of outright threat, that a lone widow might find life considerably easier if she reconsidered his offer to buy the land, or failing that, his offer of marriage. Ida burned the note in her cook stove and told Pete Higgins she would sooner starve than give Silas Webb the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. But it was in late July, with the summer heat lying heavy over the Panhandle, that Webb made his boldest move yet. He rode into Mobedy and filed a formal complaint with the land office, claiming that Ida Dalton had abandoned proper residence on her claim for a period of nearly a week back in the spring, the very week that Frank's outfit had camped nearby, and further alleging improper conduct unbecoming a widow attempting to prove continuous good faith settlement. hinting darkly at scandal without ever quite naming it outright. It was exactly the kind of slow, legal poison that Pete had warned Frank about, the kind that could unravel 4 years of hard work without a single shot fired or fence cut. Ida received notice of the complaint by mail in early August, summoning her to appear before the land agent in Mobedi to answer the allegations before her claim could proceed toward final proof, and she sat at her kitchen table that evening with the letter in her hands and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, truly and completely afraid. "He means to take everything," she said to Pete, who sat across the table looking nearly as grim as she felt. "4 years of work, Pete. Everything Thomas and I built, everything I have kept going since he died. Webb means to take it with nothing more than a piece of paper and some ugly talk in town." "You have done nothing wrong," Pete said. "You know that, and I know that, and Eli knows that better than anybody. Knowing it and proving it to a land agent who has probably already had his ear bent by every dollar Silas Webb has spent buying goodwill in that town are two very different things." She wrote to Frank that same night, the most honest letter she had allowed herself to send him all summer, telling him plainly of Webb's complaint and the hearing that had been set for the last week of September, not to ask him to abandon his contract and come running, for she knew as well as anyone the weight of a trail boss's obligations, but simply because she needed him to know, needed some part of him to be with her even across 400 miles of empty prairie, even if he could not be there himself. Frank received that letter in Dodge City on the very day the Lonesome Star herd was finally sold and counted out to the buyers, the drive complete, the colonel's contract fulfilled, and he read it standing in the dust and noise of the cattle pens with his pay in his pocket, and felt the whole world narrow down to a single, burning purpose. "Jim," he said, finding his second among the crew already celebrating their successful drive at a nearby saloon, "I am not going back to Fort Worth with the outfit. I am riding south today as fast as a horse can carry me. South to the Panhandle. Frank, that is 400 miles of hard riding, and the season is turning. You will be lucky to make it before the first frost." "I will make it," Frank said, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. "You get the boys paid off and settled, and tell the colonel I will report to him properly once this business is finished. But there is a woman and a boy back in the Panhandle who need me more than the Lonesome Star does right now." He spent a good portion of his pay before he left Dodge City, not on drink or cards the way most cowhands did after a long drive, but on a horse, a young, sturdy bay gelding with good legs and a calm temperament, the kind of horse a boy could learn to ride well on, and a fine little saddle to go with it sized for a child, and he told the horse trader with a grin that it was for the finest young man he had ever pulled off a canyon ledge, and the trader, having no idea what that meant, simply took Frank's money and wished him well. Then Frank Carson rode south, alone, pushing himself and his horses harder than he had in years, sleeping only a handful of hours each night, trading off between his personal mount and the bay gelding to keep them both fresh, driven by a fear that he might not reach the Panhandle before Ida's hearing, and by a hope that burned brighter with every mile that he might reach her in time to matter. He rode into Mobedi on the morning of the land office hearing, dust-covered and saddle-sore after weeks of hard travel, just as Ida Dalton was climbing the steps of the small frame building that served as the county's land office, dressed in her best dark blue dress, her face pale but resolute, Pete Higgins beside her and Eli, his ankle long since healed, holding tight to her hand. "Frank," Ida said, stopping dead on the steps, her voice breaking on his name. "Frank, you came." "I told you I would," Frank said, swinging down from his tired horse, leading the bay gelding behind him. "I am sorry I am covered in trail dust. I did not have time to make myself presentable, seeing as I rode near 400 miles in 11 days to get here. You did not have to do that. I told you before, ma'am, there was not much choice in it." He looked past her to the land office door, where he could see Silas Webb already waiting inside, dressed in his fine black coat, looking supremely confident. Is that hearing about to start? Any minute now. Then I had best go in with you, because I have got some things to say to that land agent myself. Inside the small office, the land agent, a tired-looking man named Harmon with spectacles and a ledger book that seemed to weigh on him as heavily as the responsibility of deciding a widow's fate, sat behind a plain desk, while Silas Webb occupied a chair to one side, and Ida took the chair opposite with Pete and Eli standing behind her. "Mrs. Dalton," Harmon began, "Mr. Webb here has filed a complaint alleging that you failed to maintain continuous residence on your claim for a period in the spring of this year, and further alleges conduct that calls into question your suitability to hold the claim in good faith. I am obligated to hear both sides before I can forward my recommendation regarding your final proof." "Mr. Harmon," Frank said, stepping forward before Ida could speak, "my name is Frank Carson. I am trail boss for the Lonesome Star Cattle Company, and I believe I am the very man whose presence Mr. Webb is referring to in his complaint." Harmon looked up, surprised. "And what do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Carson?" "I have this to say. My outfit's herd was scattered by a hailstorm along the canyon rim this past spring, and Mrs. Dalton's young son went missing in that same canyon during the storm, in danger of his life from flash flooding. Mrs. Dalton never once left her homestead during that time, sir. She was searching that canyon for her son alongside myself and my men, and once we recovered the boy, injured, she nursed him back to health at her own home, on her own land, which my outfit camped near for 3 days only because we needed time to gather our own scattered cattle before pushing on. There was no abandonment of residence, Mr. Harmon. There was a woman fighting to save her child's life, same as any mother would." Harmon looked between Frank and Webb, his expression carefully neutral, and the allegation of improper conduct. "If Mr. Webb means to suggest that a trail boss offering assistance to a widow whose son nearly drowned in a canyon constitutes improper conduct," Frank said, his voice hardening, "then I would ask Mr. Webb what exactly he thinks I ought to have done instead. Ridden on past a screaming mother and let her boy die in a flash flood, all to preserve some notion of propriety that serves nobody but a man trying to steal a widow's land out from under her." Webb's face reddened. "Now see here, Carson, I never said anything about drowning children. I only meant to point out that a hired hand who happened by does not exactly constitute proper residence, and everyone in this county has heard the talk about how long that outfit camped near her place, and what might have gone on there with no husband to speak of." "That is quite enough, Mr. Webb," Harmon interrupted, holding up a hand. "I will remind you that this office deals in matters of documented residence and improvement, not in town gossip about a widow's private affairs, which frankly are none of this office's business nor yours, so long as her claim shows continuous good faith settlement, which by Mr. Carson's account and by my own review of Mrs. Dalton's improvements to this land over the past 4 years, appears entirely satisfied." He closed his ledger book with an air of finality. "Mr. Webb, I would further remind you that filing a complaint founded primarily on rumor and personal grievance, when the true circumstance appears to be a rescue of a child in genuine danger, does not reflect well on your own standing with this office, should you have further business before it in the future." Webb opened his mouth to protest, saw the look on Harmon's face and closed it again, his jaw working with barely contained fury. "Mrs. Dalton," Harmon continued, "I see no grounds to delay or deny your final proof when the time comes this coming spring, provided your improvements and residence continue as they have. This complaint is dismissed." Ida let out a breath that seemed to carry 4 years of held tension with it, and beside her, Eli whooped in delight before Pete shushed him with a grin he could not quite hide himself. Silas Webb stood, gathering his hat with as much dignity as he could muster, and paused beside Frank on his way to the door. "You have made yourself an enemy, Carson, meddling in business that is not your own." "Mr. Frank said, low and even, The day you threaten a widow and her boy, it becomes my business, and I will thank you to remember that if you ever come near the Rocking D again." Webb said nothing more, only stalked out into the street, and Ida turned to Frank with tears standing in her eyes, though these were tears of an entirely different sort than the ones he had first seen her shed in that canyon. "You rode 400 miles in 11 days, she said. "For me." "For you and for that boy," Frank said, glancing at Eli. "And because I could not stand the thought of you fighting Silas Webb alone when there was even the smallest chance I might get here in time to stand beside you instead." "You are here now," Ida said. "That is all that matters." Outside, in the dusty street of Mobity, with the autumn sun slanting low and gold across the Panhandle prairie, Frank led forward the young bay gelding he had bought in Dodge City, along with the small saddle sized just right for a growing boy. "Eli," he said, "I recall your first horse troubles started with chasing a dog into a canyon. I figured a boy ought to have a proper mount of his own, one gentle enough to learn on but with enough spirit to grow into, so you will never again have cause to go wandering off on foot after Scout." Eli's eyes went wide as saucers. "For me? Really and truly? Really and truly? What will you name him?" Eli considered this with the deep seriousness of an 8-year-old facing an important decision. "Ranger 2, he announced finally, "because he is going to be brave, just like the horse that carried me and Mama out of the canyon." Frank laughed, a full, easy laugh that seemed to carry away the last of the trail dust and worry he had carried for 11 hard days of riding. "Ranger 2 it is then." That evening, back at the Rocking D, with the hearing behind them and Silas Webb's threat finally, legally put to rest, Frank sat with Ida on the porch step where he had first told her the truth of his feelings back in the spring, and found himself, at last, ready to ask the question that had been building in him since the moment he carried Ida Dalton down off that canyon ledge. "Ida," he said, "I have been a trail boss for 6 years, and I expect I could go on being one for 6 more, driving other men's cattle to market and sending letters home when the trail allowed it. But I do not want that life anymore, not if it means being 400 miles from you and that boy for months at a stretch, wondering every single day whether you are safe, whether Webb has found some new way to trouble you, whether you might have forgotten me by the time I finally made it home." "I would never forget you, Frank Carson," Ida said softly. "I know that now, but I do not want to spend my life finding out the hard way, over and over, every season a new drive takes me from you. I have got my pay from this last drive, near enough to buy a small spread of my own, and I have got 2 good hands and a lifetime of knowing cattle and horses better than most men know their own kin. I would like to settle here near the canyon if you will have me, and build something alongside you and Eli instead of always riding away from it." "Frank," Ida said, her voice thick with feeling, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am asking exactly that, Ida Dalton, though I confess I have never asked a woman such a thing before, and I am not entirely sure I am doing it with the proper words. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you came running across that field screaming for your boy, and I do not want to spend one more season of my life pretending otherwise." Ida did not answer with words at first. She answered by leaning forward and kissing him, long and sweet and certain, there on the porch step with the canyon glowing deep red and gold in the last light of an autumn evening, and when at last she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears and something that looked very much like joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Frank Carson, I will marry you, and I will thank God every day of my life that a hailstorm scattered your herd close enough to this canyon for you to hear me screaming." They were married 3 weeks later, in late October, in the small church at Mobity, with Pete Higgins standing as witness and half the county turning out for the wedding, having heard by then the whole story of the trail boss who gave up his last horse to save a lost child, and the widow who had refused to let a powerful rancher steal her land, and how the 2 of them had found each other in the middle of a canyon storm. Eli, walking sure and strong on his fully healed ankle, stood proudly beside Frank at the front of the little church, having asked, with great solemnity, whether he might call Frank his father from that day forward, a request Frank answered by lifting the boy onto his shoulders in front of the whole assembled congregation, and declaring that he would be honored beyond measure to be called exactly that. Silas Webb did not attend the wedding, and within a year had sold the Circle W and moved on to try his luck elsewhere, having found that his standing in the county never quite recovered from the land office hearing, nor from the way the whole town had come to view him, once the true story of the canyon rescue made its rounds through every parlor and saloon from Mobile to Amarillo. Frank used his savings from the drive, along with money he made selling his services as a horse trainer and occasional trail guide over that first winter, to buy a modest additional parcel of land adjoining the Rocking D, and by spring he and Ida had combined their holdings into a single working ranch, running cattle and breeding horses, with Pete Higgins staying on as foreman and dear friend to the whole family. Ida's final proof on her original homestead claim went through without any further trouble that following spring, the land office recognizing 4 full years of good faith settlement and improvement, and the deed to the Rocking D, expanded now to include Frank's adjoining acres, was recorded in both their names, Frank Carson and Ida Carson, side by side, exactly as Frank had wanted it. Eli grew up riding Ranger 2 through that same canyon that had once nearly taken his life, no longer afraid of its shadows and its rushing floodwaters, but proud of it instead, telling any visitor who would listen the story of how his new father had climbed down a cliff face in a storm to save him, and given up his only horse to see him safely home. Scout the dog lived a long, happy life chasing rabbits through the canyon breaks, and never again led the boy into quite so much trouble. 2 years after their wedding, in the autumn of 1880, Ida gave birth to a son, whom they named Daniel after Frank's brother, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady hands. And 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, for the grace that had brought 2 grieving, careful hearts together in the middle of a canyon storm. Frank Carson, who had once believed himself cursed to lose everyone he tried to protect, found instead that his careful, watchful nature made him precisely the kind of father his children needed, patient and steady, quick to catch them when they stumbled and quicker still to laugh with them when they succeeded. Ida Carson never forgot the silver dollar Frank had given her that first spring morning, Daniel's lucky coin worn smooth with handling, and she wore it on a chain around her neck for the rest of her days, a small, quiet reminder of the brother-in-law she had never known but whose memory had, in its own strange way, brought her the love of her life. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were finally settled, Frank and Ida would often walk together to the canyon rim, the same spot where he had first seen her running across the field, and stand watching the sunset paint the rock walls in shades of red and gold and deepening purple, and Frank would sometimes take her hand and say, quietly, that he did not believe in much beyond hard work and careful horses. But he believed that some hailstorms came along at exactly the right moment to break a man's herd apart and put his whole life back together in a shape he never could have planned for himself. And Ida, leaning into his shoulder with the canyon wind stirring her hair, would answer that she believed the same, and that she would thank that storm and the trail boss who gave his last horse to save her son, for as long as she lived, and every single day after. They lived out the whole of their long lives on that combined ranch beneath the shadow of the Palo Duro Canyon, watching their children grow, and their children's children after them, the Rocking D becoming simply the Carson Ranch in time, though Ida never let anyone forget the name her first husband had given it, out of respect for the man who had helped her build the foundation upon which her second, longer and happier chapter had been built. Frank Carson never drove another cattle herd north after that final drive to Dodge City, content instead to raise horses and cattle of his own, to teach his children and eventually his grandchildren to ride sure and steady through the canyon he had once nearly died crossing, and to fall asleep every single night of his married life beside the woman whose screaming voice across a storm-lashed field had called him, without either of them knowing it at the time, straight into the rest of his life.